Well, welcome, anyway. Jeb Bevers, and I'm giving this talk on fossiling in 19th century England. And I would like to thank several people for this because it was part of my sabbatical. I did most of my sabbatical on looking around at museums across the US, 10 different museums I visited, and mostly focused on a fossil collection from the site that I have been working on since 2006, the Milk Creek fossil site, late Miocene mammal site. And the last part of my sabbatical was going to England to visit some museums and library archives to explore some fossils there and the history of paleontology and a little bit of evolutionary biology, which is an emphasis of my doctorate. So Scott Farnsworth, Penny Deans, and Steve Walker, and my spouse and others have been helpful in a lot of this. And I also need to thank some people over in England, several librarians, great people, and museum curators. And it's amazing what they will do when you ask. You know, it's almost as if they're working for you. But they were so helpful and so kind. And I can almost not believe some of the things I was able to see over there. Hey? Well, see if you can find a seat. It might be a little crowded. So, starting out, here's some of the concepts that people were considering before science entered into the picture. You know, people they need to tell stories. They need to know what's going on, and without actually looking at it in a sort of a scientific fashion, looking at the actual material in a very in-depth, long-term procedure which takes generations, here's some ideas. So these shells in England were considered to be, by some people, devil's toenails. And, you know, it's not everyone thought this, but a large number of people considered these things. Elephant teeth, or fossil elephant teeth, were considered perhaps giants' teeth or some other collection. And in, hey John, in some literature, one author looking at the history of mythological interpretations of fossils concluded and supports that the skulls of elephants or mammoths might have represented cyclops because of the large opening for the nose. These are belemnites, which are little remnants of a shell of a squid-like ancestor from the Jurassic and Cretaceous times. And some people in England were thinking that, these are really common fossils around the coast and other locations, that these particular fossils represented thunderbolts, and the petrified thunderbolts, which they might be able to use as some curative property, as it indicates there. Maybe it helped. There is a placebo effect. And the interpretation of ammonites, which I happen to have an ammonite, you can pass it around. An interpretation of an ammonite is that they might have been petrified snakes. And this was, at least for a while, believed enough that curiosity sailors who sold these fossils would carve snake heads onto them to add to that folklore. So I don't know if this laser pointer works. No. Well, anyway, the time I spent briefly over in England, most of it was in London in terms of time, to visit the British Museum, or Natural History Museum, and library archives, the Linnean Society and the Royal Society library archives, and just about 20 miles out of there is Darwin's house, Down House, over at Lyme Regis, around here. This is part of the Jurassic Coast. This particular photo is from a site where they talk about walks. So if you look at all the red and blues, these are actual hiking trails in England. Gives me an idea next time I might go to the Isle of Wight, sometimes known as Dinosaur Island. Maybe do a hike around it. And I was also in Cambridge at some museums and libraries there. A quote from Darwin. It is highly important for us to gain some notion, however imperfect, of the lapse of years. What an infinite number of generations, which the mind cannot grasp, must have succeeded each other in the long roll of years. And this was at Downhouse, Darwin's house. But this is really critical. In order for modern science and geology, paleontology, and biology to make sense, you have to have an immense amount of time. And this is something that Darwin needed for his concepts and other people needed for their concepts to explain fossils in a paleontological scientific sense. A bit earlier, this Italian Agostina, he is one of the first people to actually interpret fossils as something other than inorganic remains. Before Agostina, most people would look at these rocks and they'd see curious little impressions, and even though you would see them repeating in the same types in a particular formation, you might see a lot of the same fossil specimens, they just thought it was formed inorganically. So it was just part of the rocks, nothing that really had to do with life. But Agostina was one of the first writers to actually postulate that these were actually organisms at some time. This is one of the specimens that he collected. This is from the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. And that's a reproduction of his little booklet on the fossils, vain speculations of these remains in the rocks. One person that looked at Agostina's material and also made his own interpretations, many of them not quite correct, but at least he was starting to do this, is Woodward, John Woodward, and he formed the foundation of what is now the Sedgwick Museum. His Woodwardian collection became the basis of that museum. He was actually a doctor, but he was interested in natural history, geology, which wasn't even quite a science much when in the 16 to 1700s when Woodward was doing this. But he started to make a systematic classification, which is something else that biology, geology, chemistry, they have to do. They have to classify different types of things. And so he was making a classification. Maybe it wasn't very correct, but it was, again, a good starting point to work towards. Here's a little bit on Woodward, and as it indicates, he was primarily a physician, but some physicians made a bit of money, not all of them, and they could do a little other things that they were interested in. This is one of his books, which catalogs some of the fossils. He collected something like 1,500 specimens that got put into the basis of this museum. And here's a few of his specimens, and I don't know, can you see or not really see? Yeah. These here are kind of interesting. You may not be able to see it, but these are actual plastic or molds, wax molds. One of the first, I think, wax molds of any fossils today. Paleontologists make lots of molds of various fossils. If you go to many museums, the majority of specimens you'll see on display are molded and cast from the original material. Now it's a close-up of the same thing. Some more of Woodward's specimens. One of the two people at the Sedgwick Museum, Matt Pemberton, is working on a big paper on Woodward's collections. And this is at the Linnean Society Library in London. And the two librarians, Lydia and Emma, there. And right up here is a snakeskin python collected by Alfred Russel Wallace when he was over in South America. Another person that we owe a debt to is Carolus Linnaeus, and he proposed and made the first biological classification system, which we still use today, with a specific genus, species, two-word name for any particular organism, such as Felis domestica, the house cat. Before his time, everything was pretty much descriptive. So you could have pages of descriptions to try and figure out what one particular grasshopper was. And after his time, you still might need pages or some characters to describe it. But if you had the name, you would still know what it is. You wouldn't have to start all over again from scratch. Georges Cuvier in France was one of the early proponents of biological change. Geologists were just starting to come down to the foundation and understanding that the Earth was a fair amount of time in age, and Cuvier developed this hypothesis that in the formations, which people were already seeing in the late 1700s to early 1800s, Cuvier understood that there were extinctions going on, that species disappeared. You know, those great mass extinctions with the end of the dinosaurs. And then afterwards, you don't have dinosaurs and large sea reptiles, and ammonites are gone, but you have other animals. So he came up with what was prominent in that time, of course, is pretty much a fundamentalist type of interpretation, and he thought that maybe there was a series of creation events rather than a single one. And so a disaster, many things are wiped out, and another one. The peculiar thing I believe personally about his explanation is not that he came up with such an explanation. I can understand in that historic setting why he would do so, but that he would think that every event afterwards was more perfect. Because in my mind, if a perfect being had created things, why would it be less perfect the first time? But that's what he was thinking. Erasmus Darwin, who was Darwin's grandfather, also a surgeon, and came up in his 1797 book, Zoonomia, a concept of biological evolution. But it was just a little speculative chapter, which didn't have a lot of explanation, just some philosophical pondering that species might have changed over time. And this was something that most people did not consider because they thought that species were immutable and did not change, that as they were now, they were always. William Smith, a forerunner in geological understanding. He's the Englishman that produced the first geological map in the world. And I've been reading, I'm about 3/4 done, with a book that I picked up in England called The Map That Changed the World. Yeah. And you should look at it, at least if you haven't read it. But in 1815, he produced that map. And he supported that different strata could be identified for the very first time based upon specific fossils, such as particular ammonites or other shells, mostly marine strata in these fossils around England and Wales. This guy walked 60,000 miles, an estimated number of miles, and also took coaches and stuff, but he walked a great deal to look at the strata. He worked in the mines, in the coal mines. He worked building canals. He was a surveyor, engineer, contracted for, and sometimes he would determine that a canal shouldn't go the shortest particular distance, but maybe we want to go this direction because I want to see what those strata are over there and if they correlate with this strata. So he might make people work a little harder just so he could get some information. But he also had an extremely difficult life. He came from a poor family and had a modest amount of money. He started to make good money as a surveyor and became well known in his canal work. Got hired by a lot of good people. Then he started on this obsession with building the map, and that kind of reduced some of his work. He'd have to go back to work on the map, go back to work on the map. And then when he was promoting this map and he found a few people that might assist in publishing it because it would be costly, the newly formed Geological Society went and visited him, and 8 years later, they took from one of his assistants a lot of his data and almost ruined him. Basically, financially, they kind of did ruin him. So these are the sorts of things that Smith would have used to identify specific strata, differences in these fossils. And here's some more that he might have used. A lot of ammonites. These are all, no, that's a brachiopod, but most of these are ammonites here. And this was from one of Smith's books on identification of the strata through specific fossils. And so that's one of the pages from his books. And this is the map that he produced. And I was reading that only about 20 copies of the original map exist, and hindsight. Unfortunately, I was in the same building where one of the copies is. It's in the Geological Society in London, but I was working at the Linnean Society Library, and I did some other things there. If I'd known it had existed then, I would have walked around the corner and taken a picture of it, but I didn't. Another early and important geologist, Charles Lyell, helped to build some of the literal foundations of geology, at least in terms of sedimentary geology. And his concepts were that sediments were forming relatively gradually. What you observe today in terms of erosion and materials washing down in rivers and streams and being deposited on banks and seashores and other areas is the same process that you observed in the past. And he isn't the first to have observed it, but he did an awful lot of work to strengthen this foundation, this support, and he also looked at some fossils in different layers. And he and other early geologists of the late 1700s to early 1800s were coming up with the concept that you needed a lot of time. Darwin's quote there, you needed a lot of time for this to happen. If you see a sedimentary cliff that's 200 feet high and it takes a centimeter, estimated average, for one layer of that, 200 feet, it's going to take you millions of years to build this up. There was no absolute dating in geology in the 1800s to early 1900s. It was all relative dating, and at that time, ages of the Earth were tossed around as short as, say, 10 million years or as long as 1 billion or more years. And I think Lyell considered it to be about 200 or 300 million years at least, but no one knew precisely. They just knew it was a long time. This one is for Beth. This is at the Sedgwick Museum, and I'm holding Sir Charles Lyell's rock hammer. All right. Over on the Jurassic Coast in Lyme, Regis, and around Exeter and the Dorset, southwest England. It's an extremely well-known fossil site for marine fossils from mid-Jurassic through Cretaceous material. It's almost all marine material, occasionally some terrestrial fauna, but probably coastal terrestrial fauna have been found there. And there's some of those ammonite fossils, the thunderbolts, and the spiral ammonites, ichthyosaurs. A person that is most pivotal for this area, at least in our early understanding, and some of the basis of interpretations for geology and paleontology is this figure over there, Mary Anning. Can you see that or not? Okay. If not, we can dim the light again. I don't care. So that's out at Lyme Regis. You can just go around in the limestone shell rocks and look around, and you'll find things like this ammonite here that my son just about stumbled over. And there's the museum with the Lyme Regis Museum with Mary Anning. In her time, she did so many things that it's not remarkable that we know about her and recognize her today. And many people in paleontology now consider her to be one of the founders of paleontology, and the interpretations and observations that she made really strengthened a lot of the work that geologists were doing at that time. But in her day, she lived I don't think she was unhappy. She was a pretty outspoken, outgoing person and relatively positive most of the time, but she definitely lived a poverty-stricken life. She was born in 1799 and survived till 1845. She came from a poor family and pretty much most of her life she was relatively poor, although occasionally she did have some money from fossil cells. Her father was into obtaining fossils as curiosities, selling it to passerbys or wealthy individuals generally, and also did some carpentry. In 1810, when she was 11, her father died in a landslide, and she and her brother continued with the fossil work. Her mother oversaw a lot of this as well. She got to know just about every significant geologist of the time. William Buckland, Henry de la Beche, and Charles Lyell, etc., and even Richard Owen. This is Mary Anning's rock hammer, at least one of them. And she herself almost died in a sediment collapse once, but her dog, Border Collie, did get killed in it, but she survived. This particular photo, and it's a reproduction of the painting, is by Henry de la Beche, who was a geologist in the early 1800s, a friend of Mary Anning's. And this painting is one of the first known and recognized of all scientific illustrations reproducing what life might have been like in the Jurassic in that time period, 140 million years ago. Here's an ichthyosaurus, another sort of ichthyosaurus there, a plesiosaurus, and several ancient fishes. Those thunderbolts, those little shells of ammonites or belemnites, La Beche had cracked open some of these and had been able to, adding water, get some of the 140 plus million year old pigments of ink, just like our squids and octopi today would produce, and he used that to paint at least a good part of it. So not only is it one of the first scientific illustrations of an ancient world, but it used ancient animal pigments for it. This is an illustration from a newspaper that is dated in 1840 from the South Dorset, Lyme, Regis area. And this location where people are gathered around and picnicking and marveling at, this area the week before had been up at that level. So big landslides. It's dangerous material. The limestone and shale there is not quite as strong as our granite. But when it slips, then if you're a fossiler, it's really a great time to go out and look for new materials. And here's one of Mary Anning's discoveries, coprolites, or fossil feces. She is the one that first indicated that these little artifacts that she found in the abdominal cavity of her ichthyosaurs and other ancient organisms probably represented fossilized poop. And William Buckland, one of the geological friends of hers there, as well as many other people, actually became quite enamored with the concept of coprolites. And he published on it and did acknowledge her a little bit. She wasn't directly acknowledged in many of the publications, but sometimes people gave her some credit. Oh, there.
And speaking of poop,
yeah. Here's William Buckland, a geologist from Oxford who went over to the Lyme Regis area and purchased several things from Mary Anning. Eventually became really good friends with her and assisted with some finances. In the last 7 years of her life, he was one of the people, but there were several persons in the Royal Geological Society that voted to give her a pension. So the last 7 years of her life, she was getting a pension from the Royal Geological Society. This is Buckland's table at the Lyme Regis Museum, and it's a nice polished cross-sectional inlay of lots of coprolites. There's an illustration of Buckland talking to a lot of students at Oxford in the 1830s. Notice all the female students. So that's another reason that Mary Anning is such a marvel. She was female and became recognized as making incredible contributions. She came from a poor family in a Victorian age, and she still was brilliant. one of the other individuals, or two of the other individuals that Anning had befriended were the Philpott sisters, and they came from a relatively wealthy family, which helped, but they were interested in the geology. They really loved Mary Anning, and they went out and fossilized with her and grabbed things, and they also introduced her to some of the other geologists of the time, including Charles Lyell. Here at the Natural History Museum, formerly the British Museum, but it's the Natural History Museum, is one of the plesiosaurs that Mary Anning had collected. My daughter's pointing to. And these are not replicas, these are originals. Another plesiosaur of Anning's. It says Lyme, Regis, Dorset, an estimated 203 to 194 million years. The first articulated plesiosaur skeleton ever found. Another plesiosaur with Mary Anning's photo over there. And one of her ichthyosaurs, where she first was studying the coprolites from. And this one was the largest ever found, at least in England at the time. At the Natural History Museum Library Archives, there's incredible artifacts in terms of historic writings. And this is John Anning, Mary's brother, writing. And, they have to make a living. And they are desperately needing funds a lot of times. Here he's writing off to the British Museum. Some time ago, my sister wrote you concerning the Ichthyosaurus tenurostrus, which you thought proper to refuse. For reasons which you assigned, sir, I write now to offer you notice a specimen of the Ichthyosaurus, which I have in my possession about 3 feet in length, very perfect, head and eye beautifully preserved, and with the last vertebra of the tail, paddles and ribs equally fine. In fact, it is so perfect that its osteology can be clearly ascertained, a very fine cabinet specimen. So a lot of selling points, and its weight not more than 30 or 40 pounds, and the price 20 guineas. Answer for return, please. A letter from Mary Anning herself. Sir, I hope you will not be offended by my addressing you on the subject of the fossil which I had the honor of sending up to the British Museum at the desire of Mr. Buckland, a geology professor, for the sum of 50 pounds, which I hope you have received safe. I am very sorry to hear that the fossil is considered dear. The same sum was offered for it before Mr. Buckland saw it. I shall be very happy to make a difference in the price of any other fossil that I may find hereafter and which may be thought a good enough to be purchased by the British Museum. As I am a widow woman, she never married, and my chief dependence for supporting my family belong by the sale of fossils, I hope you will not be offended by my wishing to receive the money for the last fossil, as I assure you, sir, I stand much in need of it. And that was the truth, even though she really wasn't a widow. But another relatively early reproduction, somewhat more dramatic, of Jurassic life in the coastline. This is from a book that was a relatively good seller in the 1840s by Thomas Hawkins. And here's the Sedgwick Museum, where the Woodwardian collection lies, and many other things are as well. In Cambridge. Yeah. That's another photo of the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. This is Matt and Dan, and they were showing me around, and they've got good taste, you can see. Oh, plus the fossils. Curators for the museum. And one of the things that they showed me, and I think I have it in my notes, I couldn't locate it, but and I'm not even sure if it is certain. But this particular specimen, this is a dinosaur partial limb bone fragment. It is nothing special, except for the fact that this represents, as far as they know, the earliest known museum collection of any dinosaur specimen. from the 1600s that Woodward purchased, and then it got into the museum. So the earliest known dinosaur specimen in a museum. Adam Sedgwick, which the museum is now named for, was a well-known, very popular geologist in the early 1800s and mid-1800s. And he did lots of fossiling himself and collecting of different rocks in localities across England and Wales. And he was also influenced a lot of people, including Charles Darwin, who was one of his students. This is parts of Adam Sedgwick's office material now on display at the museum. And Adam Sedgwick's hammer and a few more rocks and one of his notebooks. And one of the statements he indicates here in his notebooks, I think, is something that, at least in terms of teaching, we like to think is a good model. And lastly, that I might bring together a class of students who should listen to my teaching, support me by their sympathy, and help me by the labor of their hands. And I know that hopefully it's a mutualistic type of relationship between professors and students, but I know that a lot of students have supported me, and hopefully I've done the same in return. This is an ichthyosaurus that Adam Sedgwick gave to the museum, and a fossilized well vertebra that he had. A couple of individuals here that are known, at least historically, but not very well in most corners. But I think Gideon Mantell and his wife Mary deserve some hand for giving us early interpretations of dinosaurs and some of the other fossils. Mary Mantell collected some teeth of a dinosaur, Iguanodon, which Gideon Mantell first named because the teeth resembled relatively large teeth, but he was looking at some specimens in a museum that resembled an iguana lizard. And so he called it Iguanodon, tooth of the iguana. And he became really fascinated with fossil collecting. He was a doctor and relatively successful in his practice at the time that she brought this fossil. And I think that was perhaps her downfalling for their family, because after that, he became completely obsessed with fossils. He stopped or sort of faltered on his practice. He moved to another location. People didn't trust him. He couldn't get enough clients, and he just kept obsessing about fossiling. Eventually, the community decided to turn his house into a museum after he had thousands and thousands of specimens, and after 2 years, that financially fell as well. But he made some contributions. Anyway, here's Gideon Mantell again. That was an early interpretation of the Iguanodon over here. And here's a later interpretation of Iguanodon by someone else who became quite a rival of Mantell's, Richard Owen, anatomist, well-known anatomist from the 1800s, who was the person that actually founded the now present Natural History Museum in London, and he split it apart from the British Museum, and apparently something that the librarian and curator there wanted. He hated the natural history part and wanted it out, so when Owen proposed separating it, he got some assistance in moving it out. But these were early interpretations of Iguanodon. This is a little bit later, somewhat more modern interpretation. And here's some Iguanodon specimens, one collected by Mantell and others by other individuals. John Henslow was the other professor who was really pivotal to Darwin, probably more so, because this was the person that recommended Charles Darwin to the voyage of the Beagle. Without Henslow, Darwin wouldn't have gone on that world-rounding trip and explored the world for 5 years. Thomas Huxley, who was also a friend of Darwin's, I think it's interesting that Huxley was the first person. There was a dinosaur Hyalurhodon that Huxley had found and worked on. He was also an anatomist, zoologist, bit of a botanist, but he connected the relationship for the first time between dinosaurs and birds around 1880. And it wasn't until the 1970s when another paleontologist, John Ostrom, studying a velociraptor he found in Utah, made a really detailed study of that fossil and found 25 characters of the velociraptor that also tied them to modern birds. Well, people started to, people love dinosaurs, and it's not just now, and it's not just when I was a kid. It's when, in the 1800s, people began to love the idea of these big animals that were once around. And there was this structure in one part of London for this large exhibit, royal exhibit, and then once it was used, the structure was moved a few miles away. I think it's quite an effort to move that, but they did. And in that structure, the Crystal Palace in the south side of England, which they placed these dinosaur replicas. And Hawkins, Waterhouse Hawkins, the same person that drew those sea dragons in that 1840 book, he was commissioned to go and design these large ancient animals, not just dinosaurs, but some other animals as well, and under the direction of Richard Owen, because Owen had a lot of influence. So those are some of the interpretations that he did. It was really successful. After its success a few years later, apparently he came out to New York, and in Central Park they had a little bit of dinosaur exhibits, life-size dinosaur exhibits, the second in the world. I think this is great. I remember when I was a kid, I saw this in a dinosaur book. Well, that was the Iguanodon that Owen had directed Waterhouse, this is how it should look. And before it was completed, they had this historic banquet in 1853 inside the Iguanodon. Who wouldn't want to eat with a dinosaur? So here's some of the exhibits still in existence. This is Megalodon, Megalosaurus, and a little bit of a modern interpretation. Although the tail should be raised up, we now know that all dinosaur tails, unless they were broken, were raised up as a balancing rod. An Ichthyosaurus. And here's the Iguanodon, or referred to here as Mantelodon, because Gideon Mantell and Mary Mantell first named and discovered it. Richard Owen, who worked on these and was an important anatomist in the 1800s. Oh. All right. In my computer, it worked out. I'll have to look at that again. I'll change the type. But yeah. In 1843, he came up with the term homology from studying lots of specimens, living and dead. And basically, he just compares that a particular structure in one organism, if he finds it in another organism, that these are related functional structures. So they may be different, but they're related in form, slightly different. And he did not consider that these were things that had changed, because he thought that instead of modification from a common ancestor, as Darwin did, that they represented some ancient archetype. And here's a sketch of Owen's archetypal vertebrate with neural spines and a few areas, some weird appendages on it. He's also the person that came up with the term Dinosauria. And because of Owen's renown, when Gideon Mantell was working on one of his two publications, one of what's called Petrifications and Its Teachings. It was about all the fossils that were known, and it's a great book. It's incredible in terms of the color plates in that time, in the 1830s and 40s, that he put together. And he purchased, I think, something like 2,000 copies. Mantell did. See, there's another road to financial ruin. And he probably only sold a few dozen because it was nearly 20 pounds at its time, I think in around 1830s. It was just, but Richard Owen overshadowed Gideon Mantell. That's another reason why his book may not have sold too much, because the same creatures that Gideon Mantell was looking at, and he had not yet come up with this overarching term of dinosaurs, Dinosauria, and so Mantell did a lot better. And reportedly Mantell had a little bit of, Owen had a bit of a jealous streak in him and was quite vindictive to some people, including Gideon Mantell. This is Richard Owen, who also was interpreting these extinct birds, the moas, when he got specimens from New Zealand. And Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Fossiling wasn't the only hobby or pastime of people with a natural history bent in the 1800s. Beetling was another thing. Going around and collecting insects, and largely beetles, because, well, half the world's species are pretty much beetles in terms of animals. So this is a few of Charles Darwin's early beetles, and he was into that so much that he made a little cartoon caricature his cousin did, got published later. Alfred Russel Wallace also was into beetling. Darwin came from a wealthy family, so he had a lot of potential leisure time, and he could focus his energies where he wanted. Wallace didn't have that ability. He came from a moderately low-class family, but he was also bright and intelligent and interested in natural history, just like Darwin. And even with a modest income, he could do some beetling collection. And after he was able to do that, when he was 19, he went to a company, and they hired him and a friend because they thought that they had the talent for recognizing different specimens, and they sent them off to South America for 3 years to collect beetles and pythons and other reptiles and birds and mammals, and bring them back to sell them to wealthy individuals or museums. Wallace had been reading a lot of science, and he wanted to try and do something with science. So while he was in South America, he also noted a lot of the biogeographic localities of these organisms, and he was able to get 2 papers published. When he's coming back on the ship with the specimens, a week into the voyage, the ship catches on fire, and all the specimens are gone. But everyone lived through that. They all got in lifeboats, and a few days after that, they are rescued. He gets back. His boss says that you corresponded well. You're doing good work. It's not your fault the ship burned. We're sending you to the West Indies, Indonesia. So that's where he went for 14 years, and that's where he came up with the same idea that Darwin came up with on natural selection. So beetling did a lot for both of them. After Darwin graduated from Cambridge, he had studied natural history in a combination of geology and biology, and he was an excellent student in that, but he got a double degree in natural history and theology, which was a common area to work in at that time. And in theology, he was kind of mediocre, but I don't think he was poor, because in his final qualifying exams, which is, if you don't pass this exam, you do not get your degree. This is after 4 years. You get examined over everything. He was in the upper 85 percentile. Or upper 15 percentile, I should say. So he did quite well. But he dreamed of going around on a trip somewhere into the tropics and collecting some things and bringing it back, because he was fascinated by different animals. And he gets this letter shortly after he's home, from John Henslow, his professor, who says that, would you want to consider going on as a naturalist on this ship, the Beagle, with Captain Fitzroy? And Darwin's really enthusiastic and excited about this, and he thinks this is great. And he goes to tell his father, who is a surgeon, and his father makes all these points out, and these are notes of Darwin's about these points, that it's going to ruin your reputation as a clergyman, because that's what his father thinks he's going to get his career as, since he did get a degree in theology. And it's a wild scheme. They must have offered to many other people, because his father also knew when he was in grade school, his schoolmaster said that your son is a lazy child, and I doubt that he's ever going to amount to a thing. And and his father told him once that you only care for ratting and birding and insect collecting. Well, all of those things that he cared about, that's what gave him his profession. So his father made a list of things and reasons as to why he shouldn't go, and he couldn't go unless his father told him he could go. Not only because of loyalty and family respect, but this was an unpaid position, and his father had to pay the way. His father was one of the wealthiest people in all of England at the time. Not because he was a surgeon, but because he and his father had been extremely successful in investments. It was mainly how they had made their money. So his father could see that he was kind of crushed after dinner, and he told him, well, he wrote off a letter to Henslow and said, I'm sorry, I can't go. And, find someone else if you can. After dinner, his father said that, well, if you can find any reasonable person who might make sense of this and show me the logic in it, then I'll reconsider, because he saw that his son wasn't so happy. So he'd give him just one more chance. And Darwin knew that there was only one reasonable person in his father's mind, which is his uncle, Joseph Wedgwood. And he rode over to Wedgwood's house and spent the night, talked to him about this story. And his uncle said, well, I think this is a great idea, because you've always told me you wanted to go and do some natural history. This is your big chance. You'll probably get some publications. It would probably be good for the Darwin family name. And I think your father should reconsider. And it's the HMS, it's His Majesty's ship. They would not put you on a forlorn, moth-eaten ship ready to sink. They're putting you on something really good. So he wrote out some notes for his father. Darwin took it back, and his father, after breakfast, said, oh, yeah, you can go. And right after that, apparently Darwin hired a coach and took a coach from southwest England all the way over to Cambridge. It's something like 14 hours changing coaches. Arrives the next morning about 3 or 4 in the morning, goes and knocks on Henslow's door, wakes him up, and he's worried that Henslow's already offered the job to someone else, but the mail isn't exactly as fast as Darwin was. So he got on. This is the room in the Royal Society. This is in 1858 when Thomas Huxley presented the theory of natural selection jointly from Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And it wouldn't have been presented just then, except Darwin, after he got back from the voyage of the Beagle, in 1836, he left in 1831. Around 1838, he started to come up with the idea that species might be modified, and he started to add to these concepts. Probably by 1848, he had the idea almost fleshed out. He had a draft of about 140 pages. He never published it. Another book came out about the same time, which didn't have a lot of scientific basis, but it just talked about how species might have changed, and it was not well received. And Darwin thought, well, I better wait on this. In fact, he was thinking maybe he should wait and publish it posthumously. He had a chronic illness, probably from the voyage. So, yeah, water. Anytime he started getting stressed out, his illness spiked. When he got back in London, he got to know a lot of people, including Owen, Charles Lyell, etc. And after a couple of years there, he felt London was too stressful, so they moved it down 20 miles to the southeast of London. Nice country area. And he rarely went back to town after that. And so The reason he wasn't here, though, when it was presented, is he was grieving, they were grieving for the death of their 2-year-old son who had just died, and Wallace wasn't there because he was still in the West Indies. Here's some specimens that Darwin collected in 1832 off the Beagle on the South American coastline in Uruguay and Argentina. This is parts of Macrauchenia, a large mammal, and there's Pip Brewster, curator of the Natural History Museum, holding other parts of Macrauchenia. He was really fortunate in collecting these, and all of his large mammals, it's not surprising that he found here, are holotypes, which means they are the type specimen for that particular species. The first time ever it's been described. That's an artistic rendition of what Macrauchenia looked like. And perhaps you saw something like that in the opening scenes of that great documentary, Ice Age, walking by. So here's some more notes of Macrauchenia, which Darwin was putting in. Richard Owen looked at all of these specimens for him and described them in the fossil mammals, or fossils from the Beagle. Owen was looking at all the fossil mammals. This is a ground sloth that Darwin collected in another part of Argentina. And as it indicates up there, Richard Owen was describing it. More jaw piece from the ground sloth. A reconstruction of the entire skeleton, which sits in a display in the museum. And I think these teeth are just incredible. What are they? Huh? You recognize them, right? Horse, of course, right? They're horse teeth. Now, this note you can't see, but this note, maybe you can read it. This is a particular species from South America, Equus curvidens, the first discovered evidence of horses in the New World. Charles Darwin. And there's Toxodon jaw piece, another of these holotype mammals, which Darwin found over there. I've got some teeth of Toxodon, and there's a reconstruction of Toxodon. One of his lines, and he was right. He was lucky with fossils and a lot of other things. Not lucky in everything, but many things. Charles Darwin a little bit later. And that's at Down House. From 1838 till his death, Darwin lived mostly at Down House and rarely traveled outside. Occasionally, but it was extremely rare that he traveled out of Down House because it was secluded, it was quiet, it reduced stress and a lot of his anxiety and perhaps the Chagas disease that he picked up in South America. His thoughts were that the Beagle determined everything in his life, and I think he's correct. Without that voyage, we would not be talking about him. Alfred Russel Wallace would have come up with the theory of natural selection, but it would have taken probably 10 to 40 years before natural selection would have become prominently known around the world, because Wallace's paper was not widely received. It was a short little paper. Wallace even hesitated sending it off, and he sent it to Darwin first to look at. Darwin came out with a book the year afterwards, which he'd been working on since 1838, and it was 450 pages. It had substantial support, and that was the book that made the big impact. There's a little reproduction of Darwin on the Beagle. He had to share the cabin with two others, and it also happened to be under one of the masts of the ship, so splitting right in the middle of the cabin. This is his recreational area at home. Although the last couple of years of his life, this table was filled with notes and pails of worms, because his last book he ever worked on was on earthworms and what they did in terms of tilling the soil, and he found out that they certainly churned a lot more soil than plows ever do. And that's his research area, his writing room. he would spend every day when he was healthy at home. He got up early in the morning, probably had a little tea, and went for a walk for an hour or so, came back, had breakfast with his wife, read the newspaper, chatted, talked with his kids briefly, and then started to work on some project, came back, had lunch, and then did another walk and did some writing for a few hours. Here's where he was walking, and that's his greenhouse where he did, it wasn't anyone's typical greenhouse. This was a greenhouse where you did experiments and you'd get 2 different books on carnivorous plants and orchids published. And that's a portrait of the beagle, and it's done by Conrad Martins in 1832 or 33. This was from his, you can find it online, at least some of his sketches, but this is a photo I took from his original sketchbook that's at the University of Cambridge archival library area. 2 volumes of his sketchbook. And I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that they would just hand it to me and I would be able to look at it because this is the original. But anyway, that's the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.